Right, let's speak to James Spencer, former chairman of the Association of UK Oil Independents, spent 9 years at BP. He's now managing director of Portland Fuel, an oil trading company. Good morning.
Good morning, Nicky.
What will your former colleagues at BP be saying about this right now?
I imagine they're probably quite happy, seeing as $80 a barrel is better than 25, which is where it was 3 years ago.
Yeah, the geopolitics of this is interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the backdrop to all of this, I mean, so we're rightfully focusing on the last 4 to 6 weeks, but the price of oil has been ticking up steadily since January, mostly on the back of the production cuts that have been successfully implemented by OPEC. There's also not a small issue in the total disintegration of Venezuelan exports. That's rarely covered, but that's had quite a big impact in terms of Venezuelan exports have gone down by about a million barrels a day.
Why is that?
The socioeconomic problems there. Their whole infrastructure is, unfortunately for them, is falling apart. I mean, there's obviously some big political issues there with the current presidency of Maduro, and he's very much in dispute with pretty much the rest of the oil-buying world. So that's a factor. And the other factor, of course, that again is very relevant. Demand continues to go up. So last year, the world consumed 95 million barrels a day. That was more oil than the world has ever consumed. And this year, we will consume 97 million barrels a day. So that's up by about 3%. So demand continues to grow. So we'll put all of those factors together and you have a price that's steadily ticking up.
What about the oil-thirsty countries, the economic growers like India and China? Where are they buying their oil from?
Well, that's a really interesting question, Nicky, particularly with the Iranian kind of sanctions, because one of the things, again, that's rarely covered is when we had the Iranian sanctions previously, China and India they weren't party to those sanctions. So they continue to buy Iranian oil, and they, even if Donald Trump, well, obviously they're going to go ahead with that embargo, it's unlikely that the Chinese and the Indians will follow that. So they will certainly continue to take Middle Eastern oil, including Iranian oil. And at the end of the day, when there's more demand than supply, it doesn't matter whether it's China or India buying it, or the European oil majors or anyone else. If demand outstrips supply, prices go up.
And the European Union position on this?
Well, again, they're clearly very unhappy with the decision by the United States for a whole host of reasons, I think. But I think they will probably follow suit in one way or the other. In the end, it's a big, bold move to go against US sanctions. But also, you've got to remember that the oil majors, the major oil companies who obviously buy a lot of oil, if they flout any new sanctions on Iran, they will risk having their assets and operations frozen in the US, and that's a risk they won't be willing to take. So probably the European position will be slightly between China and India and America hard stance, China and India continuing to buy, but the oil majors will almost certainly have to follow any sanctions set by the US.
OK, what about the environmental aspect? Will the high price lead to more exploration in some of those beautiful wildernesses we have? The Virunga National Park is threatened at the moment, a UNESCO Special Heritage Site, and mountain gorillas are threatened. We've got Alaska and everything. Will this encourage more exploration?
Well, it's an interesting kind of dilemma that I suppose the kind of whole environmental question has, because if the price is very, very low for oil, then that's no incentive for explorers to pull the oil out of the ground. So in theory, that would be the kind of demise of the oil industry. But equally, if the oil price goes so high, then alternative energies become much more attractive because typically they have been more expensive. So, yeah, you know, it's a bit of a rock and a hard place there in terms of what environmentalists would want. But certainly from the perspective, if the oil price goes up and demand, this kind of insatiable demand we have for oil continues, then of course the explorers will be looking at more remote places. That being said, the shale oil revolution, which we've experienced in America, proves that not all oil is in remote places.
OK, there are huge arguments to be had there, but what is the future of oil? Do you believe, because some people say it's, you know, in the long term, it's on the way out and it has to be on the way out, but it's here for an awful long time and there's going to be a lot of thirst for it for an awful long time, you reckon?
I think that you've summed up where I'd be. I mean, there is oil, use of oil is going to decline. I'm fairly convinced, for example, that electric cars will take over from fossil fuel cars. But equally, we have I always say when I was born, 1972, I was about the 4th billionth person in the world. There's now 8 billion people in the world. So in my lifetime, the world has doubled in population, and they will be using more and more energy, and therefore oil, yes, will be around for a long time, possibly a long-term decline, but unfortunately there is no kind of silver bullet to getting rid of oil. We're too dependent on it.
Just a quick question. How much does consumption go down when prices go up? Because I think for some people, they do decide not to go on that extra long car journey.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and that's called price-led demand erosion. That's what you'd refer to there. Basic economic theory says that if the price of goods goes up, people will buy less. Unfortunately, it doesn't work so well with commodities, because the nature of commodities is people need to buy commodities. That being said, you do have some swing factors. So the big factor coming into the oil markets now is the American driving season, and that's when Americans kind of go on big road trips, go and see family, go on holiday. And if, of course, their price is a lot lower, but relative to where it's been, it has gone up over the last few months. So you may see that impact with people just deciding not to do these road trips. And that sounds a very small example, but Americans, use a lot of gas in their terms, or gasoline. So it could have an effect, but again, commodities doesn't work quite so well, and also it's rather a long-term factor. It's rare that impact hits, in the short term.
It's tough for motorists here right now, but just finally, who in our own country is coining it at the moment as a result of this?
Well, I don't think anybody's coining it, but I can think of several businesses in the Aberdeen area of Scotland who are a lot happier with prices at $80 a barrel, and therefore you follow that one through. The government is also happier. They raise a lot more money through taxation on exploration at 80 than they did at 25. And of course, as the price goes up, VAT also goes up.
Thank you very much. That's fascinating. James Spencer, former chairman of the Association of UK Oil Independents, who is at BP for 9 years. It's a